Hello, welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms, joined by my personal professor, Bob Forrant. Hey, Bob.
Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
It's been so long. I'm so glad. And
Rebounding COVID messes things up.
Yeah, well, we won't talk about that today,
Yeah.
but we will talk about our wonderful guest that you brought, Dr. Dan Broyld. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Cheers. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, so you're the Associate Professor of African American Studies at UMass Lowell. How cool is that?
Yes, it is. It is cool, and there's a lot of history of Black people here to study and to uncover, which I'm really interested in doing. I love talking about the Underground Railroad, so this is a key juncture for the Underground Railroad, and I'm very happy to be joining the faculty at UMass Lowell in the history department.
First semester under the belt. What do you think so far?
So far, so good. Yeah. You know, it's always a challenge, just adjusting, learning the institution, Blackboard and, where's my room and stuff like that. But I think I have that under the belt now, and I'll be even better moving forward. So.
Yeah, and how do you feel about Lowell so far?
So far, I love Lowell, and I love the general area. I live personally in Lawrence, work in Lowell, but I have been able to see quite a bit of the city. Of course, having a national museum here in Lowell is great. My background is in public history, museum studies, material culture, so those are all things that, really work well to be here in Lowell.
It's so awesome, and I think that it's kind of fitting that you live in Lawrence. That's our sister city, right? Another mill city.
Are they called the Twin Cities? Is it Lawrence and Lowell? I've heard that.
Is that?
I thought it was Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Oh, okay. I'll take it out of the.
That's okay. You can coin it.
Yeah.
It's our New England Twin Cities.
Copyright it, and
Right.
they're basically formed by the same well.
Okay.
So they're definitely linked that way.
Well, I heard that from a Boston native, so I thought that was something that I need to be localized and know. So
maybe that's a talk in Boston.
Yeah. I mean, well, given that they're both mill cities, and we know why, or where the capital came from for these mills to be started, definitely directly from the slave trade. Let's get into it, guys. We know that there are stops here in the Underground Railroad here in Lowell. Like 33, right? Yeah, 33 stops in the Underground Railroad, which we've been learning, I've been learning characters like Nathaniel Booth, who, was a freedom seeker here in Lowell and went up to Canada, ended up coming back. But we never talk about what happens when freedom seekers go to Canada. And that's kind of jam, right?
Yeah, it is. I have a book coming out, Borderland Blacks, 2 cities in the Niagara region during the final decades of slavery, that talks about this concept of the Underground Railroad not being a one-way flow from America to Canada, but actually the door of the border swung open in both directions, and people go and they come back, right? And that's an important narrative to really describe about the Underground Railroad. 2, it makes it like, it's a transnational narrative, right? It's also an Atlantic world narrative because it's British Canada, right? And so you have to think about what's happening across the pond, right, as well. And so these Black people that go to Canada and throughout Western New York have to, negotiate the overlapping worlds of the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and of course the African diaspora. And so there's a lot kind of pulling at these individuals, right?
Wow. In all of my years, whenever I think of Black folks in the diaspora, I don't even think of Canada.
Yeah.
I've never thought of Canada.
Yeah.
And as we know, there are folks who are missing from history, and you're doing that work to make sure these stories are told.
Yeah, and so, it's partly because of the numbers of enslaved people in Canada are not as high as the United States, the Caribbean, South America, and stuff like that it kind of gets missing from the diaspora. But it is a part of the global movement of Black people, and it's an important part of that movement, especially for Blacks in the United States, because after the American Revolution and the War of 1812, they kind of identified the British as better than the Americans, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they know if we can kind of get to Canada, right? It's a British territory, and we can kind of we can pit the two sides against one another for the best possible outcomes for ourselves.
And that's because Britain has done more to end the institution.
Yeah, and so black people, you know, they kind of recognize, I mean, even in the American Revolution, right, there's twice as many people that fight for the British than the Patriots, right? And so they kind of, you know, recognize that if the United States is fighting the British and the British are giving us freedom, then we're going to side
You might
with
want
the
the British to win.
Yeah, so exactly. Very absolutely. And so that's, you know, an important part of how they identify the British, if you will, as a kind of better entity than the folks in the United States. And they have to kind of use those dynamics, you know, for their own livelihood and their own freedom at times. So, yeah.
I'm like, wow, this makes me think of just like the way that folks in the diaspora have to navigate life always, just this constant like, who can we trust and who can we pit against who, right?
Right.
Like,
right.
how does it come about that becomes the scene in the early 19th century?
Yeah, so, you know, two wars, the American Revolution, War of 1812, that they get this ideal. And then, you know, once they get to British Canada, you know, there's a lot of suits that kind of come up, and the British ultimately protect them. They don't want to give them back to the United States, right? You know, and that's the kind of dynamic that plays out that really kind of helps blacks. And so they're, you know, really, you know, their disposition is freedom, and they'll use any tool that they can use to get that, to achieve that.
So if I understand that, then in upstate New York, say around like, I don't know, is Rochester upstate?
Yeah, Rochester's upstate, Western New York.
Where you were raised, right?
Yes, yes.
So Rochester is a place where there would be a freedom seeker community, and if they heard that slave catchers were coming, they would basically go for the border because they knew they wouldn't be turned in, or?
Yeah, and that's the kind of beauty of being on the fringes of the kind of establishment in the borderlands. You know, things that happen at the core of the nation cannot necessarily be dictated because you're on the fringes. And black people recognize their proximity to Canada allows them a kind of another freedom and other options, especially in case, you know, slave catchers are in town, right? You don't, you know, you can get out of Dodge, right? You can get to Canada, and that will protect you, right? And so the other thing is too that's interesting about Rochester. It's known as the burnt over district that produces like the Mormons, the Shakers, the Oneida community, the Fox sisters are there communicating with the dead, and so it's this very liberal area, very liberal area. But you know that. You know, those liberal ideals are great, and those utopian communities are great, you know, in the 1820s, you know, to the Civil War. But what really protects them is Canada. So, you know, so in Rochester, a lot of attention has been paid to those utopian communities, you know, like the Shakers, like the Oneida community, and not the fact that they're located close to Canada. And that's the most important thing for black people, is being near and next to Canada.
I mean, I feel like in general, right, and speaking as an American historian, right, I know almost next to zero about Canada, other than that I know part of my family came from Quebec, and that story. But the story of what you're talking about, or Native history of Canada, or working class history of, it's just really, it's interesting. And especially being in Massachusetts, where there are lots of French Canadians, that there's not more of this sort of history. So I guess, what got you hooked on the idea that you ought to like pursue that as obviously a big part of your graduate studies, and then this book? What intrigued you?
Yeah, I went on a long detour before I got here. Yeah, I mean, I was like, you know, majoring in like East African history and stuff like that. But I realized in the diaspora, right, that Black Canada was kind of being left out. And two, I felt like my upbringing, being raised in Rochester, some 80 miles from the American-Canadian partition, where I traveled to Canada so much that I remember asking my mom if I was American or Canadian, right? I didn't even, you know what I mean? And so I thought that, you know, in the title of my book, Borderland Blacks, I thought I was a Borderland Black, right?
Okay.
And the fact that this narrative of what really makes Rochester and borderland communities important is their proximity to Canada. I mean, when people come to Rochester, it's like, oh, let's take you to the falls. That's what we do, right? You know what I mean? But we don't kind of think of ourselves as being a part of this transnational space, international space, right? And so I wanted to kind of reshape the perception of what Rochester was in the past, and really kind of situate it in that framework of being a transnational, international space.
Wow, it also makes me think of how we talked about Lowell and so many folks came down, and we had a huge population of French Canadians here, right. And like it is interesting that we don't talk about the history there and why it was safe for Black folks to be so close to the border or to be able to go into Canada and the environment there. Were they able to have, like in Lowell, there were businesses that were run by freedom seekers and folks who were just living free already here. Was it similar there?
Yeah, very, very much so. Blacks did really well in Rochester, New York. The population was some 700 Blacks. Because it's a borderland community, you can't get exact numbers because it changes every day. It's an inward and outward bound flow, if you will. But yeah, the community in Rochester did very well in terms of when you compare it to like a Buffalo or Syracuse. But when you compare it to the other city that I examined in the study, I examined Rochester, New York, and St. Catharines, Ontario. When you compare it to St. Catharines, Ontario, Rochester pales in comparison. And so that's the kind of beauty of looking outside of the United States, is you can kind of get to see a more holistic picture of Blackness that is not just national, and not just local and regional, but transnational and international.
So you get to see, not to put words in your mouth, but in a sense you get to see the possible.
Yes, yeah. And two, you know, what I kind of describe with the community in St. Catharines is it's really like a maroon community. I mean, they're runaway. More than half of them, 50% of them are runaways, right? And, you know, another like 20% are connected to slavery, you know, through generations, right? And so this is a maroon community, as you would think about in the Caribbean, where, you know, people would take to the mountains and, you know, establish these kind of maroon communities, right? And so I look at them as maroons, right? They're runaway slaves, you know, from America that find themselves in Canada and build communities. And in St. Catharines, they build their own colored village, right? And so when it came time for them to kind of integrate their schools, they said, no, we want separate schools. We just want our tax money to be put into our Black school. And so they're really kind of showing a dynamic of maroonage, right? I mean, they're generally all runaways, right? And they have this disposition, we're gonna build our own community. We don't need to kind of integrate into the greater St. Catharines community, which I find really dynamic for people, you know, before the Civil War. I'm like, wow, that's really dynamic.
Yeah. And when I think of thriving Black communities, even like before the Civil War or after, I always associate it with some kind of tragedy, because oftentimes we know there's some kind of massacre or some kind of static that happens where that Black community is now no longer becomes Central Park or Lake Lanier, right? And so was there that kind of static when Black folks are like, no, we're going to do our own thing, just let our money go to our schools and our community? Was there any kind of static? Are those communities still there?
Yeah, that makes me think about, you know, the ways in which I describe, you know, Black people running away from enslavement. I talk about Black people trying to seek and reach the outer spaces of slavery. And when you think about it, when you're enslaved in the American South and you say that there's free Black people in Rochester, New York, you know, that own property, right? That's like the future. That's like outer space, right? And even more outer space was like the St. Catharines community.
Completely different.
Yeah, you're going to another universe, right? And this is where I kind of bring in some Afrofuturism as well, because these Black people are using railroads. They're also crossing suspension bridges into Canada. So they are using the most modern technology to get out of enslavement, right? And so they would take a rocket ship out of slavery if they could, right? The train was the most modern form of technology, and they're riding it, right? They're riding the New York Grand Central Railway, through Rochester, and they're going over, a suspension bridge in Niagara Falls in 1855. They're going, riding the railroad track over a suspension bridge. I mean, that's pretty modern, right? I mean, it's pretty, you have to be pretty sophisticated to do this, right? And so when I look at them reaching the outer spaces of slavery, I love it what this one artist, Sun Ra, says. He says that space is not only high, but it's low. So they have to navigate the black holes and find the stars, right? And that's what they're doing in St. Catharines, right? So they're reaching the outer spaces of slavery, right? And then they, yes, there's black holes, there's all types of stuff, but they have this color village where they can live and thrive, and that's the kind of star, if you will. And of course, there's the potholes of, prejudice and, all types of things that are going on, them not getting their fair share of tax monies and stuff like that. So.
Right. How is it now? Are there thriving Black communities out there now? Yes,
there are thriving Black communities in Canada. They have generally migrated to the larger metropoles, so like Montreal, Toronto, etc. And so there's a smaller but growing Black community in St. Catharines. Niagara Falls is not too far as well. So they are doing quite well. And it's really a diasporic community. You have a lot of Africans, you have a lot of people from the Caribbean and stuff like that. So it's really a
Probably
dynamic.
Jamaica, right?
Yeah,
Certain
Jamaica,
yeah.
I mean, all over the Caribbean. So the immigration policies are a little bit more relaxed in Canada, so it's kind of harder to get in the States.
Unlike the United States where they claim it's full, right?
Right. Yeah, and Canada actually needs labor, so they have to kind of accept outsiders, if you will. Right?
Is there, so thinking of here where we've been trying, lots of people in the community for a while to create permanent signage and sort of documentation of this history that we've been uncovering, so when people walk around, they bump into it, right? So they don't have to actually go into a bookstore. Randomly when they're walking, if their eyes are open, they see the history.
Right.
Is there anything like this in Rochester or so along the border that might say, this is the likely place where these events like this would have been happening? Is there that sort of stuff going on?
Yeah, there are markers. It's not really cohesive, and I think that, in a lot of parts in the country, we have to do a better job with this. So in many respects, Lowell is not unique, and it hasn't really kind of marked this history and really kind of packaged it in a way where you're right, that people would be walking on the streets of Lowell and just be bumping into it here and there and everywhere. So yeah, I think that we, nationally, we need to do a better job with that. And so, yeah.
So your other work, you mentioned at the start that one of the other sort of areas of interest is public history.
Yes.
Can you talk about, I know you've done some work for the National Park.
Right.
Not around here, but in other parts of the country. Can you tell us a little bit about some of that?
Yeah, so I work to build the Harriet Tubman National Site in Cambridge, Maryland. From start to finish, literally, from just land, if you will, to the building of the museum. And, I always thought, as a historian, I would, write books and articles, that's fine. But to say you've been part of a building of a new museum is really, really interesting and really dynamic. The other thing that is kind of telling about it is that it's a museum that has no artifacts of Harriet Tubman within it. And so it's really an interpretation center. And it really kind of speaks to, the fact of to have a museum, do you need artifacts? And we kind of prove that you don't. We really are just interpreting the history. The one thing we can say is that the site is on land that is between the two plantations that Harriet Tubman was enslaved on. So that's the one kind of artifact that we have. But everything else is just kind of, it's an interpretation center, really, that is a museum. And so I think it's Stephen Kahn, he has his book, do museums need artifacts? And I guess they don't, right? Because we built a whole museum, and it's really just an interpretation center that I guess is built on the artifact of the land that Harriet Tubman would have crossed in between.
Wow. And I know you talk about Harriet Tubman in your book too, right?
Oh, yes, because Harriet Tubman lived in St. Catharines for some 7 years. And so she's an important part of that colored village that I was speaking of. She brings a lot of people to town to that colored village, right? And so a lot of the people that arrive via her, which is really interesting. Her brothers live in St. Catharines for a while. On the outskirts of St. Catharines they moved to as well. And so Harriet Tubman is a major part of the story. She's also passing through Rochester quite a bit, receiving monies to go over the suspension bridge from Frederick Douglass and stuff like that. But Harriet Tubman is a person that understands borders, whether they're racial, sexual, or national, right? She's crossing borders, and that's what I really like about her. So whether it's North-South borders, right? Whether it's American-Canadian borders, or whether it's Confederate or Union borders, she's going to cross all of those borders throughout her life, and she understands what it means to kind of transcend borders.
Oh man, that is so cool. When you were describing kind of like the space, I found it very poetic and a beautiful way to describe it. And it also kind of called back the book The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Oh yes,
which is about Harriet Tubman,
right.
And it's a little bit, maybe not Afrofuturism, but definitely there's some magical realism in that book. If you haven't read it, you should. It's really, I don't know. Have you guys read it?
Yeah, I have read it. Yeah, it's a very good book. And, Afrofuturism is interesting, is an interesting tool for African American history. Today, I think about, enslaved people that, the Underground Railroad releases their black inner geek. They can't, in slavery, they can't really reveal how smart they are. But once they run away, you know how smart they are, right? And that was the thing, too, that was so interesting about, like, about slave holders. They would kind of blame it's those, abolitionists, it's those Yankees,
planting
if you will.
Those ideas.
Right, planting those ideals. They're not smart enough to get to Canada by themselves, right? They have to be getting these ideals from somewhere. But what the Underground Railroad proves is that that releases the black inner geek, right? They can show how intelligent they are and reach the outer
Did
spaces.
you just say
of
the black inner geek?
Yeah, the black inner geek.
Okay.
Because you can't show slavery, right? Even if you're smart, right? You can't hey, I know my way around. Like, you don't want to.
I just wanted to make sure I heard the phrase coming up.
Yeah.
I love it.
Right. So, you can't read. You're not supposed to know how to read, but many people,
Right.
And so, in a sense, you're not able to show how intelligent you are, right? And by running away, that shows your intelligence and your fortitude and your ability to transcend, space and time.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I love it. And create strategy, got to be innovative, and even just the subversive way that enslaved folks learn to read it's always one of the most fascinating things to me. And I feel like those inner geeks pave the way for us.
Yeah,
we get to be outer
right.
geeks.
Because when I went to high school, it wasn't cool being a geek. But today, it's like my nieces and nephews. I'm like, you guys are geeks, and it's cool, right? And that's neat, right? So coding is fine,
Yeah. And Afrofuturism is such I feel like it's a thing that's coming up right now within different communities, and you have people like Octavia Butler with the Parable series, and which is eerily prophetic to where we are today. Another, you read that during the pandemic, and you might be radicalized.
Right.
But you read things like that, or now N.K. Jemisin and people like that who are taking Blackness and that struggle for freedom and putting it in this beautiful way. And I feel like that's kind of what you did, but with actual history and real facts.
Right. And so that's the thing that Afrofuturism is not like kind of applied to. It's kind of a modern day philosophy that I'm retroactively applying to history. But when you think about, you know, Afrofuturism and applying it to like the Underground Railroad, it totally works. They're using the most modern technology to reach, you know, freedom. They're also using things like the North Star, right? And so, and also it's a form of technology to rub like pine spruce on the bottom of your shoes to, you know, to throw off the dogs that are catching. I mean, that's a technology. Yep. That's like freedom technology. That's fugitive technology. I mean, so like, how do you get free? Well, here's some ideals, right? You know, like Frederick Douglass dressed up as a sailor. Like you know, there's all these types of dynamics that kind of go into, you know, getting freedom, right, and achieving it. And it takes a certain ability and a certain knack that is important. And Afrofuturism applies well, especially to the Underground Railroad.
Wow. Well, Dr. Dan, I cannot wait to read your book. I'm so excited. You're like, this is what Bob and I do all the time. He gets me excited about history. He just gave me this book today. This is one of my favorite things, but especially Black history. And I'm so glad that there is an Afro-Am professor at UMass Lowell now, which is amazing. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Welcome. And thank you so much for being on the show today and telling us more about the Black Borderlands and your book, Borderland Blacks.
Yes, yes, very much so.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Bob, for bringing him, because this is awesome. And
It
I
only
can't wait
took
to
us
talk
2
more.
months to coordinate schedules.
Right, yes.
It worked.
Yes, yes. Now you got 2 Black geeks on your hands. What are you gonna do? And thank you all for tuning in. This has been History in Lowell.